Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon. I guess it's in between. Welcome to Deutsches Haus at NYU. My name is Juliana Canfield. I'm the director here. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Telos conference, which we have the honor of co-presenting together with our wonderful collaborators from the Telos-Paul Piccone Institute. I'm looking at Mary. Thank you again for a wonderful collaboration. Thank you, David. And as most of you know, we do this every year, and it's, I think I already said that last year, but it still works. Alle Jahre wieder, like every year, again and again. We have this event today. We also have the beginning of Chinese New Year, so happy year of the dog. And it's been feeling like a dog year in a different way. I shouldn't make fun of that because the dog year in Chinese, in the Chinese sense might be a good year, but we'll see what happens. We have surprises every single day these days. In any case, so what are we doing during this conference? I actually have no idea, but I'm happy to be here and learn more about constitutional theory as problem global perspectives. I have a cultural background, that's why I have no idea. I have other qualifications, but in this field I know nothing, and we are of course absolutely delighted to have Bernhard Schlink here as the keynote speaker tonight. Welcome, Bernhard Schlink. Thanks for joining us. And this will be very short, so all I do now is to ask you to please silence your cell phones or switch them off. And see, many people forgot, and I forgot too, and I will do this momentarily as soon as I get rid of the mic, which I'm planning to hand over to my esteemed NYU colleague, Zhidong Zhang. And so please join me in welcoming him here tonight. Thank you for coming.
Welcome everybody. I'm Zhidong Zhang, the director of two institutes involved in the organization of this conference. One is China House. Some of us will be there can you hear me? Yeah. In the concurrent panels tomorrow. China House is also a co-sponsor in locating that fabulous restaurant later this evening. I'm also the director of International Center for Critical Theory, or the ICCT. And allow me to say a few more words about this center. It's an international consortium consisting of NYU, University of Tokyo, Peking University, and now Australian National University. So it's a four-member network. And critical theory is the thing that puts us together. And through member centers, I think especially in Beijing, the Peking University Center, we could sense this. It's been going on for more than a decade, I guess. This Schmidt theory, if I can say that. It's quite a phenomenon. Exactly what to make of it, I guess it's still reading and interpreting this trend. But we could say for sure that there has been an intense interest, fascination, some would even say obsession with Schmidt. To a certain degree, there's an overlap of a critical traditions, German, French, Hegelian Marxist tradition. So encountering with Schmidt, but also there is this deep-seated post-Mao philosophical intellectual development, starting with early 80s, this fascination with Heidegger, with German existentialism or irrationalism. That's the rubric on which many post-Marxian developments were studied. So it's really a fascinating development. And in our Tokyo Center, by the way, we have scholars from all these centers, other than the Australian Center. As you can see walking around the room, it's more diverse. Just in personal experience you receive in scholars of Asia engaging in these topics of political philosophy, constitutional theory. I hope this is a positive addition, a productive one, that will make the conversations today, tomorrow, and Sunday more interesting. I'll join my Illinois colleague in welcoming all to New York, to Washington Square. Too bad it's raining. Hopefully tomorrow will be better. I guess we will say a few things about logistics later, after the keynote speech. So now I will hand the mic to my co-organizer David, and let him say a few words about this conference in general, as well as to introduce our first keynote speaker.
Okay, welcome everybody. So this is our, I just counted, 14th annual Telos conference in New York City. Welcome. This conference theme, Constitutional Theory as Cultural Problem, is part of a longer research project that we're beginning with this conference. Well, I guess we had a kind of, this is the kickoff conference, but we had a pre-kickoff conference in Moscow just this past September. And unfortunately, one of the speakers at that conference in Moscow, Andrei Matuszewski, was supposed to come here, but he wasn't able to get a visa because of the difficulties with obtaining visas to the U.S. now. There's this incredible delay in getting visas, so he was unfortunately not able to get one. So that was very upsetting for us, because he would have been a wonderful addition to this conference. But the follow-up to this conference, we were planning another conference in Berlin in 2019, in the summer of 2019. So please keep that in mind, and hopefully we'll have some of you there as well. We're organizing that with the Center for Literary Studies in Berlin. So overall then, for this conference, I just want you to keep in mind that we're going to be doing videotaping, and so if you have not signed the release form about the videotaping, please do so. I guess the other thing is just to keep in mind, I mean, I think most of the people here are registered for the conference, but we've got these dinners that are organized for the paid registrars of the conference, okay? So, I would like to introduce Bernhard Schlink. So, Bernhard Schlink is actually very well suited to this conference because, since it's about constitutional theory as a cultural problem, linking those two areas, because he's distinguished himself as both a jurist and a writer. So on the legal side, he's had an extraordinary career. He's been a law professor at the universities of Bonn, Frankfurt, and the Humboldt University in Berlin. But he's also served as a justice of the Constitutional Court of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany for almost 20 years. And if anything, he's had an even more extraordinary career as a writer. I think many of you probably know his book, The Reader, which reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Received the Hans Fayada Prize in Germany, the Grinzani Cavour Prize in Italy, and the Prix Laura Bataillon in France. And it was also made into a movie, an Academy Award-winning film. And other books that he's written have also won awards. Recent other publications, Flights of Love. Very recently, last year, he came out with, in English, The Woman on the Stairs, and in Germany just a few weeks ago, this new book has come out, Olga. So he's been very active on both sides of this divide that we're trying to bring together at this conference. So today he will be speaking on minimal constitutionalism. So please welcome.
In 1747, Frederick the Great moved into Sanssouci Palace in Potsdam. finding that the clatter of the mill sails on Miller Arnold's windmill disturbed him, he wanted to buy the mill, but the miller refused to sell. In response, the king threatened, "Do you not know that the king can take your mill without paying a single groschen?" The miller replied, "Certainly, your majesty could do that, were it not for your majesty's high court in Berlin." The king gave up. How could he fail to respect his court's independence when he himself had made the courts independent? This anecdote first appeared in print in the 1787 French publication about Frederick the Great's life. It was, however, in early 19th century Germany that it became popular. It is a very German anecdote. In contrast to Great Britain, America, and France, Germany did not become a constitutional state as the consequence of the popular revolution, but rather as a result of compromises between the monarch on the one hand and the bourgeoisie on the other, as a result of a delicate balance struck between the monarchic and the democratic principle, to put it in 19th century terms, through gradual constitutionalization of the monarchy. For many citizens, the longing for full-fledged democracy was not so strong as the longing for a full-fledged Rechtsstaat, in which, to pick up on Michel Rosenthal's explanation of the German term Rechtsstaat, quote, "Law becomes the only legitimate channel through which the state can wield its power, and the citizens enjoy protections through the institutional framework of state rule through law." In the anecdote, Miller Arnold did not merely draw the king's attention to the independence of the royal courts. Implicitly, he also made clear to the king that this was not an interaction in which he was dealing with the miller as a ruler deals with a subject, but instead was a property owner dealing with another property owner. In his capacity as the owner of the palace and the miller's neighbor, he could not exercise his rights as the sovereign, but could act only within the frame of private law. That is why the king could be brought before the Berlin High Court, a private law court. The constitutional state in Germany began to develop when it became possible for a liberal private law regime with independent private law courts to exist alongside the authoritarian public law regime. When scarcely any political civil liberties or participatory rights existed, early private and economic realms of liberty did nonetheless exist, and when conflicts arose within these realms, legal protection was afforded by independent private law courts. Legal protection against state exercise of sovereign rights through the state administration emerged later. It emerged earlier in Germany than elsewhere, for in Germany it was the functional equivalent of parliamentary oversight over the state administration. Parliamentary oversight was limited because in Germany's constitutional monarchies the government did not have to rely on the parliament's confidence, but depended instead on the confidence of the monarch, while the parliament's remit extended only to legislation and the budget. But the administration was not authorized to encroach on citizens' liberty and property unless empowered to do so by legislation. As the Rechtsstaat in Friedrich Julius Stahl's classic 19th century definition not only, quote, stipulates the paths and limits of the state's activity, but also intends precisely to determine and unshakably to ensure the free sphere of its citizens within the sphere of law. It was not merely legislative authorization of the administration that was essential. Legal redress vis-à-vis the administration was also crucial. I begin my lecture with this chapter of German constitutional history because it often came to mind during the years in which I was involved in the German-Chinese and German-Vietnamese Rechtsstaatsdialogue on the Rechtsstaat. This German-Chinese and German-Vietnamese dialogue is rooted in agreements between the German government and, respectively, the Chinese and Vietnamese government, and once a year brings together German and Chinese or German and Vietnamese law experts and legal practitioners to accompany, stimulate, and foster development of the Rechtsstaat in China and Vietnam. I cannot judge whether the events proved useful in any way to the Chinese and Vietnamese colleagues. The discussions were difficult. Often, the questions raised after the paper was presented had nothing to do with the paper, and the answer had nothing to do with the questions. And it was impossible to ascertain whether it was the colleagues or the interpreters who had not understood or had misunderstood what had been presented and answered. We know how complicated it is even to engage in an American-German exchange of views on the rule of law and the Rechtsstaat. Such discussions must rely on the terms, historical and systematic context, and will go astray if these contexts are not borne in mind. The two terms do at least share enough common facets to allow us to understand one another by equating the two concepts. I had only the most superficial notion of the historical and systematic contexts underlying the Chinese and Vietnamese terms used to translate the German concept of the Rechtsstaat, and conversely, I am sure this was not different for the Chinese and Vietnamese colleagues. The dialogue encompassed a broad range of topics, for instance, human rights, legal protection of the individual, the legal constraints imposed upon the administration, rule of law principles governing the market economy, state emergency powers, disclosure of governmental and administrative information, protection of intellectual property, criminal proceedings in the Rechtsstaat, all indubitably important topics in gradually establishing the Rechtsstaat and the constitutional state. However, in the conversations that I had in the margins of the dialogue, sometimes with students who happened to be there, sometimes with lawyers, practicing lawyers, I developed the impression that the problems they encountered with Chinese and Vietnamese legal deficits stemmed less from a lack of rule of law principles governing the market economy, the issue of state emergency powers, or of criminal proceedings in conformity with rule of law precepts, but arose rather from a lack of reliable legal protection in everyday situations. There was no thought of challenging the party's authoritarian regime in the public domain or in public law matters. However, carving out small realms of freedom for private matters and economic activities, and ensuring reliable legal protection through independent private law courts if conflicts arose within these realms of freedom, was not too far-fetched nor too wildly optimistic. I can also recall one conversation about democracy. It was with a Chinese European history and German studies scholar. We got on the topic of the constitutional monarchy. Could that be a model for China? Would it be possible that rather than the monarch, there would be the party holding responsibility for government, administration, and the military, flanked by a freely elected parliament with competence for legislation and the budget, or perhaps only for legislation? Something along these lines, perhaps, sometimes in the future, is mild and shrugged. But you could definitely not imagine that China might sometime in the future be a democracy governed by the principles of constitutionalism. After an anecdote about Frederick the Great, anecdotes about my participation in the German-Chinese and German-Vietnamese dialogue on the Rechtsstaat, that does rather indicate that my presentation will not offer any bold theory, no critical theory, but rather doubts, conjectures, questions. I have great admiration for the work that has been done under the rubric of constitutionalism on comparing constitutions and devising optimum constitutional principles. At the same time, I have lost faith in the idea that states around the world are making their way, sometimes more slowly, sometimes more rapidly, but in any event inexorably, towards implementing the principles of constitutionalism. Some states stop moving down this avenue, some travel in the opposite direction, some opt for an entirely different course. How can we respond to this? States' current constitutional constellations, or those they are currently moving towards, can be expressed in terms of various categories. Alongside liberal democratic constitutions, a growing number of non-liberal democratic constitutions exist. Socialist constitutions had begun to develop into liberal non-democratic constitutions and have broken off or even reversed this development. In some states, the borderlines between the separated powers become weaker. In some social or welfare state constitutions, the social or welfare component is dwindling. The constitutional form currently developed by nationalist authoritarianism in Russia, Hungary, and Poland still appears to be a perverted form of liberal democratic constitutionalism, yet may become so distinctive and enduring that it merits categorization as a specific constitutional format. We may also fail to gauge the significance of capitalist feudalization in the USA correctly if it is perceived solely as a perverted constitutional form rather than as presaging the emergence of a distinct post-liberal, post-democratic constitutional mode. Important though it is to register and categorize, it does not help that much to understand the development currently unfolding. I would like to try to understand the developments leading from the present to the future by remembering the developments that have led from the past to the present. Whether we think of past developments leading to democracy, or to the Rechtsstaat, or to the rule of law, the decisive catalyst was always an economically robust middle class, keen to further consolidate its position, and which therefore in the first instance required a realm of economic freedom and reliable administration of justice. Once this class enjoyed sufficient economic strength, it also desired political power. This middle class engaged in trade and commerce in Great Britain, cultivated America's soil in the British colonies, and in some instances progressed from artisanal production to industrial manufacturing and factory production, as was also the case in France and somewhat later in Germany too. This middle class differed from country to country. However, The differences do not alter the typology of the bourgeois as a subject engaged in independent economic activity who needed economic freedom to achieve economic success. In other words, this middle class required freedom to trade or engage in commerce, along with protection of property, and sought reliable guarantees to secure these freedoms, in the first instance through independent administration of justice, subsequently acting through Parliament to protect freedom and property against encroachment by the executive, and ultimately by taking control of state authority. Other freedoms, freedom of assembly and association, freedom of expression, freedom of the arts and sciences, freedom of religion, were connected to, yet not entirely defined by, economic freedoms, just as intellectuals and artists were part of the middle class as a class, and at the same time were not really defined in class terms. The proletariat also appropriated the culture of the middle class, with its hallmarks of learning, reading, self-education and self-development, intellectual and artistic life, and without taking on board the middle-class economic program. Instead, the proletariat transported its own economic situation of organized, common, dependent factory labor into the trade union as a form of political organization and into the Socialist and Communist Party, and demanded the preconditions crucial to working class emancipation, along with freedom of opinion, assembly, and association. These included freedom to participate in shaping labor and employment conditions, legal security in the labor struggle, social security provision for illness, invalidity, and old age. Our conception of human dignity stems from a philosophical tradition that runs from antiquity through Judeo-Christian notions of man as made in God's image all the way to Kant. At the same time, this notion of dignity is grounded in the idea that citizens, as bourgeois and citoyens, and as the proletariat, have developed from subordinates to subjects with agency who, confident of their economic significance, seek respect as rights holders and wish to shape society politically. How could enforcing or even maintaining the principles of constitutionalism fail to be affected when the economic basis from which those principles emerged changes dramatically or is simply absent? If there's no economically powerful middle class, it cannot demand the requisite rights, freedoms, and associated political impact. If paid employment is no longer an organized, shared activity, but instead occurs in isolation, it cannot forge a political community nor underpin political organization. If, in addition, people fear that they will lose their job or indeed jobs for one that does not suffice to earn a living, and even more so if the livelihood comes not from their own labor, but rather from state benefits, perhaps even over 2 or 3 generations, there simply is not anything that could serve as a basis for self-confident demands for civil rights and freedoms or for political impact. Admittedly, there are always intellectuals and artists who make their voices heard. However, the importance accorded to those voices depends upon how many others, citizens, workers, employees, pensioners, feel understood and represented when intellectuals and artists speak out. It therefore comes as no surprise that moves towards developing liberal democratic constitutionalism have no chance of success in Russia, and have experienced huge setbacks in post-communist states in Eastern Europe. Who there is supposed to lead the development towards liberal democratic constitutionalism? Who is supposed to push it forward? Work, wages, and pensions, a flat, clothing, and food are more important than civil rights and freedoms, and as long as Putin takes care of those needs and ensures that discontent with plutocracy, mismanagement, and corruption is silenced by pledges of national grandeur, he will be re-elected with a solid majority and dispense with civil rights and freedoms. Although a middle class has emerged in China and Vietnam, it is made up to a substantial degree of officials and employees from the state apparatus and state corporations. With little autonomy and self-confidence to counter the stated party, they are ill-suited to drive moves towards liberal democratic constitutionalism. Hopes that the triumph of capitalism with its entrepreneurial and market freedoms would go hand in hand with the victory of liberal democratic constitutionalism have at present been dashed. Only occasionally do the changes wrought to the economic basis by capitalism help constitutionalism to advance. To a larger degree than in China and Vietnam, India's growing middle class is made up of owners of small and medium-sized businesses and stabilized democracy. Where women are needed on labor markets, it is impossible to deny all rights to them. Even in Saudi Arabia, a woman who work and need to travel to the workplace must be allowed to drive. However, neither state enterprises nor multinationals need liberal democratic constitutionalism. They do not even need the Rechtsstaat and the rule of law to handle conflicts, preferring to resolve these conflicts through arbitration. Liberal democratic constitutionalism is also under threat in Western democracies, and here too this is a consequence of changes in the underlying economic basis from which this constitutionalism emerged. Concentration of social wealth in the hands of just a handful of individuals, the associated weakening of the bourgeois middle class, the disappearance of traditional proletariat, the emergence of a class of employees in precarious employment relations who can be fired as easily as they can be hired, and an omnipresent class, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, of long-term unemployed. The populism nurtured by these changes assumes varying forms from country to country. But wherever it occurs, this populism draws on and feeds into nationalistic resentment, and it draws on and feeds into resentment against the established political system. Wherever they emerge, these resentments express a genuine experience of being left behind and abandoned, which springs from the changes in the economic fundamentals I mentioned before. Resentments are articulated in relation to a whole host of different phenomena. Sometimes one country or a particular region in a country lags behind economically. Sometimes entire industries have declined, collapsed, or moved elsewhere. Sometimes there are significant numbers of refugees or migrants, as well as fellow citizens with a clearly identifiable foreign cultural background. Sometimes resentments are a response to increased crime. Resentment against the established political system also takes many forms. Sometimes it is couched in a racist or sexist vein that can target specific political representatives. Sometimes it takes the form of bitter critique of the lack of political responsibility. Sometimes it is perplexed by the lack of political transparency. Sometimes it is outraged by the mainstream jargon which excludes and represses other voices. And on all fronts, resentment expresses the perception those at the top of the ladder, chasing after the rewards of legal possession of power, do not take citizens and the elite seriously, but simply want to take their votes. Populism can be instrumentalized to serve various interests, and is deployed in particular to serve the interests of the rich. We can observe in the USA how this happens and the consequences it produces. Where citizens full of resentment oppose the established political system, they allow its rule of law safeguards, its tax justice, social security, or achievements in protecting health, pregnancy, privacy, the environment, and the natural world to be smashed. We can observe too how populist ideological exploitation can become entrenched through manipulation of voting districts, election procedures, and vote counts, and by suppression of voters during registration and voting. Capitalism not only destroys trade unions, it also forces employees and customers to assert their rights against firms and corporate arbitration tribunals rather than in independent state courts. At the same time, it does not care whether someone doing business is heterosexual or homosexual. Indeed, openly expressed gay and lesbian lifestyles and culture even suit capitalism, offering an interesting market segment. That is why a conservatively dominated Supreme Court can appear to be liberal by approving same-sex marriages in an era of capitalist privatization. On the whole, though, we live in an era in which civil rights and freedoms and fair procedures are being weakened rather than strengthened. What can be done? If I should be invited to participate in the German-Chinese or German-Vietnamese Rechtsstaat dialogue again, I would suggest to discuss small rather than large topics. Topics linked to the Rechtsstaat or the rule of law in everyday life. For example, legal disputes between landlords and tenants, buyers and sellers, employers and employees, first instance court proceedings, the rights and obligations of lawyers, the rights of citizens detained in custody by the police, application procedures for building permits or business licenses, or how to obtain permission to hold an assembly. I would ask that the topics be illustrated by presenting cases and discussed in the light of cases, so that in the end participants in the dialogue would appreciate what the Rechtsstaat and rule of law mean in practical terms, and what human and civil rights mean in practical terms in everyday life. It is only on this everyday level, on the everyday economic level, that the Rechtsstaat or the rule of law can become so tangible that citizens will value it and foster it. Possible steps to combat populism can take a similar approach. Here I am speaking on the basis of experiences in Germany and from my personal experience. Since 1990, I have been working in the part of Berlin and the part of Germany that belonged to the GDR, has lagged behind the western part of Germany since reunification, has responded to this with resentment, and has been particularly susceptible to populism, initially to the left-wing variant and now to right-wing forms. On the one hand, resentment and populism can be tackled through communication. For over 20 years, an initiative has brought together Germans from the East and Germans from the West in groups to share their German experiences. Participants tell their life stories, ask each other questions about these narratives, but must not express any criticism. Getting to know each other dissipates resentment so successfully that such discussion circles are now also organized with Germans and Turks participating and with Germans and Poles. In the discussion circle I participated in, as in many other conversations with people from former East Germany, it emerged that resentment arises not merely because Eastern Germany lags behind the West economically, but also due to legal and political abandonment. If people's living environments change due to zoning regulations, closures of schools and police stations, due to migrants and refugees being housed nearby, or as a result of deteriorating public transport links, and if there is no adequate political communication about these changes, if citizens' concerns are not heard and not taken seriously, if legally enshrined procedures for citizen participation are not observed precisely, and if there is no respect for citizens' rights to be informed, to discuss, and to raise objections, this does rarely lead to vigorous protest, for that would require economically powerful citizens, but instead generates disinterest, resignation, and resentment. This holds all the more true if citizens experience similar contempt at the Labor Office or the Social Security Office when they renew their driving licenses or apply for a building permit. Here again, the rule of thumb is that everything the Rechtsstaat or rule of law offer and can achieve, all the benefits they provide, must be made visible and tangible with scope for practical implementation. If I were American, my thoughts would also run along these lines, and I would argue for taking the citizens' concerns that populism exploits and plays on more seriously. Furthermore, I am surprised how much interest and also involvement my American liberal friends direct, in particular to the federal elections, and how little to voting. I understand that democracy developed in the USA much more directly than in Europe, where the state, with its structures and procedures, preceded the emergence of constitutional democracy. I also understand that therefore in the USA, establishing voting rules and regulations does not simply precede the democratic struggle to attain a majority, but instead, traditionally in any case, in part constitutes the spoils of that struggle. However, I find alarming the way in which today whoever wins the elections can exploit the opportunities for calculation, simulation, and manipulation afforded by computers so effectively that, although a landslide victory by political opponents cannot be hindered, small shifts in majorities most certainly can be prevented. As important as to win elections, it is to ensure that the victorious party deals more scrupulously with the political spoils. And there is an urgent need for defending the rule of law and advocating rules and regulations that no longer allow scope for voting districts, electoral procedures, and vote counts to be manipulated, and that ensure that voters can no longer be suppressed during registration and voting. My thoughts also run along the same lines when it comes to the European Union. Again and again, laments are heard that people no longer accept the European Union and do not value it more highly. One reason that has been identified lies in the European Union's democratic deficit, the lack of a European public sphere or of European political parties, the fact that the European Parliament is not elected on a one-person, one-vote principle and does not have a status within the concert of European institutions tantamount to that of a national parliament. Against the backdrop of European linguistic diversity and the resurgence of nationalism in certain countries, this democratic deficit cannot be overcome, at least at present. However, if we once again look back over history through the prism of constitutional law, we find in the Holy Roman Empire a political constellation that had profound shortcomings in terms of political decision-making and cohesion, yet which nonetheless endured for almost 900 years until its demise in 1806. One, many historians argue the most important reason for its survival and acceptance, was the law, which not only placed a loose band around the member nations, but more importantly, could be invoked by subjects of the empire in its courts, the Reichskammergericht and the Reichshofrat. I believe that acceptance of the European Union by its citizens, which cannot now be increased through greater democracy, could be augmented by more options to bring court proceedings in European courts, through experience of the European Union as an institution based on the principles of the Rechtsstaat or the rule of law that citizens can use to assert their rights successfully. Let me conclude. I assume that I have given a somewhat German paper. In Germany, constitutionalism began with demands and achievements related to the Rechtsstaat, and the communist regime in East Germany ended when citizens insisted that the few remained pledges of the Rechtsstaat that still existed in their constitution and legislation be respected, including the right to observe vote counting in local elections. Assertion of this right in May 1989 revealed a massive level of electoral fraud and led to drastic delegitimization of the regime and the Revolution of November. Perhaps in an era in which constitutionalism is threatened and weakened, it is also German that I focus on the element within constitutionalism that are derived from the principles of the Rechtsstaat or the rule of law as minimum standards. However, as I mentioned earlier, I can offer only doubts, conjectures, questions. Doubts that the victory of constitutionalism, which includes certain, will actually occur. Conjectures that it is worth reflecting on those constitutional minimal standards that form particularly essential elements of constitutionalism, considering which can currently be most fruitfully promoted and encouraged in other countries, and recalling that we should hold fast to and reinforce these standards, particularly energetically in our own countries. The question of whether in particular Rechtsstaat-related or rule of law elements of constitutionalism number among these minimal standards. That question leads to further questions, precisely which elements are concerned, which elements under which conditions, what form might legal protection of citizens by European courts assume, which electoral rules and regulations can be argued as being required and demanded by the American Constitution, how can the potential and benefits of the Rechtsstaatlich rule of law be made more tangible and thus better serve to counter resentment of the political system? How is it possible to begin to introduce principle of the Rechtsstaat and rule of law in countries such as China and Vietnam in a way that does not hurt the party, that nonetheless carries the seeds of further development towards the Rechtsstaat and rule of law? Questions and more questions. And moving towards the Rechtsstaat is a laborious process. At the start of this talk, I recounted the anecdote about Frederick the Great and Miller Arnold, which, like generations of children before me, I was taught in elementary school. Unfortunately, the story isn't true. There was and still is a wheat mill next to Sanssouci Palace, but it didn't disturb Frederick the Great, who rather liked to hear the clatter of its singers. Miller Arnold also existed, but elsewhere. He lost his watermill to account in court, had his appeal overturned in the High Court, and petitioned the king. The king suspected that the count had been unfairly advantaged, proclaimed that the miller was in the right and had the judges of the High Court imprisoned. Unjustly, as a glance at the files reveals. Frederick the Great was anything but prepared to respect the independence of the courts, either in Miller Arnold's case or in other instances. Germans' fondness for this anecdote only later became an expression of pride in the Rechtsstaat's successful evolution in the German monarchies. Initially just expressed the yearning for the Rechtsstaat to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If information is more valuable than anything else in the evolution of the constitutional theory, for instance, Thomas Jefferson said he would rather have a free press than free elections, because with the free press he could probably eventually get free elections, but free elections without a free press may produce a meaningless result of Putin in Russia or something like that. And Germany evolved, academic freedom came out of Germany. The printing press came out of Germany. The power of the word and the power of knowledge may have overwhelmed some of the other structures and forced them into more democratic evolutions over time. It just, what are your thoughts about that? That knowledge is maybe the ultimate power?
Well, the printing came out of Germany, but not the free printing, the free press.
Yeah.
So I think
But
that
academic freedom did emerge out of Germany first.
academic freedom in the 19th century and even in the Weimar Republic was far from fully accepted. We have case after case where someone who was too left-wing, too revolutionary, too anarchist was thrown out of academia. No, I think it has to do with maybe with different evolutions of democracy in the US and on the European continent. In the American evolution, democracy or the constitution preceded the state. And so I think if democracy and the constitution precedes the state, it's natural to say it all starts with freedom of opinion and free press. On the continent, the state came before the constitution and democracy. And so on the continent, the democratic evolution built on the acceptance of procedures, protocol, institutions that could kind of be filled with a new spirit and that could be added by new forms of participation. And there, the focus on how does voting operate? Does everybody have the right to vote or get the right to vote gradually? Was more focused on than maybe in the United States. And of course, free press is a part of freedom of expression and assembly and association. It's a crucial part of that. But it wasn't quite as in the United States where it all began with freedom.
That's great. Lots of interesting things. I wonder though about it, if there's a tension in the approach in the following way. You begin by talking about diversity of constitutions and constitutional contexts and historical developments, and wonder about the project of comparativism. But then as you move along, you start to make claims that are transnational and rather global with respect to the contemporary political situation and what's going on around the world, and how to give account of some of the movements, populist movements that we see. To me, the account you give doesn't sound. I mean, obviously, there's lots that's true. You can't deny that. There's profound economic disturbance. There's the entire communities have been seeing their livelihoods disappear. There's massive stuff. All of these things, I'm not going to disagree with. But still, the account to me doesn't sound like the account of an American. It sounds like the account of German or European. And so I'm trying to think, why is that? Well,
because I'm German.
Right. So there are a lot of things that I would acknowledge in your account, but a lot of things are missing. It strikes me as what an American thinking about these problems. We start thinking about. First of all, I'm not sure about your premise about the middle class. It's an interesting thought, but it's not exactly what I think about as the kind of leading edge of constitutional reform in this sort of movement in this country. There's no real discussion about social movements. Social movements. There's no identification of the great moments of American constitutional history, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement. There's effort to capture the importance of the historical narrative in the American account, as if it's all dependent upon contemporary economic circumstances. So I'm not so sure about that. Now I think, it's very difficult at the moment for us to know what's aberrational and what's and contingent and what's actually in the long term. If 77,000 votes had been different, we'd be in the Clinton administration. We know there's been lots of shift in support, and it's ongoing. the problems you identify as characteristic of American political problems are well known and being addressed, it seems to me. So, I tell my students for a long time, there's only two things you should look up as you graduate from law school. One is the right to vote, and one is prison reform, right? So there's a massive effort going on now about doing something about gerrymandering and about registering. And I wouldn't have put the problem, it is a problem of political spoils, you're completely right about that, but the Americans have been hobbled in some way by our federalism doctrine, trying to deal with this problem as well. And that's another important piece of the story in the United States, the tension between the local and the national. So I guess my question is, how much, when we think about constitutional pathologies, let's use that general term, or whatever we want to say, contemporary constitutional developments, we have to keep in mind the first principle, which is these are local stories, and they're going to be quite different in different contexts, and they're going to understand things that occur in similarly in different places in different ways, and therefore the possibility of response has got to be local as well. So I would have a clue what to say to the Vietnamese or the Chinese as to what they should do.
Yes and no, it's local, but I think it's not just local. I have read again and again and again that the white Trump voters were middle-class people who either felt disenfranchised or were afraid of being disenfranchised in the ongoing economic development. And that is something that mirrors fears in the middle class in Germany, among the middle class that votes for the AfD. And it mirrors what I read about other countries, Europe at least too. So you are certainly right that I don't know enough about the United States of America. There are many things that are missing in my perspective. But as far as the middle class fear of being abandoned, disenfranchised, not being able to take part in the development is concerned, there at least, everything I've read here, the United States and Europe are not part.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for a fascinating lecture. I just wanted to ask a kind of question that's both historical and contemporary. So the historical dimension would be, what was lost in the sort of transition from more sort of unwritten, constitutional arrangements based on customs to the more formalized arrangements that you mostly spoke about? So the constitutionalism that was very much based on written documents, what everything that became the Gold Gazette, etc. So is that something that you would say was lost in that process, or was it only a question of progress and gain? And more specifically, if you like, and that's the contemporary element, and maybe this goes slightly beyond, the framework here, but I'm sort of interested in what your response would be to the very famous paradox that was enunciated by Buchenfelder, who famously said, basically a liberal secular state lives on premises that it cannot guarantee itself, right? And basically the idea is you need a kind of sense of social cohesion and shared moral norms to make a constitution work, but the moment you try and reinforce that, you kind of undermine the very liberalism on which that whole sort of system rests. So how do you solve that dilemma? How do you make a constitution work, especially in the contemporary context where you've spoken a lot about the cultural and social divisions that we encounter in different societies?
This is the most famous and most often quoted sentence, I think, in German constitutional law since the last 20 years. I think it's wrong. We have schools, and schools are of utter importance for exactly that point. and we have universities, and we have a cultural life, and the state is engaged in this cultural life, at least in Germany, probably much more than here. So, yes, the state cannot guarantee it, and it cannot certainly not enforce it, but the state can do a lot for it, and can misdoing what can and should be done. And this is in particular the field of education in schools, high schools, universities. And I mean, Rückenförde was my teacher, and we often discussed the sentence, and he said, yes, you have a point. Schools are what I didn't include into this, but at the same time, of course, it has a point that what comes out of churches and comes out of free associations of all kinds, that is crucial for a democratic culture, that of course is nothing that the state can induce or enforce. And to the first question, in Germany we never lived without written constitutions. In a sense, you can say before constitutionalism began, each absolutist state had a kind of constitution. But going from that to the written constitution that then gradually approached the standards of constitutionalism, that transition, there was nothing lost. And later we just had written constitutions.
Yeah, I was just wondering in the kind of Anglo-Saxon context of customs and precedent, which I think is a bit stronger than in the more formalized system as Germany. Because of course Germany was one of the cultures that produced customs and precedents which actually influenced England before the Norman Conquest. So as always the French are to blame, but the positive German contribution was very important to the English legal system.
But you saw how I failed when I compared two countries with written constitutions. So I don't dare to compare the British evolution with the German evolution.
All right. Thank you.
It's kind of a simple practical question. I was really intrigued by your discussion of the discussion circles that are part of the constitutional dialogue and civil dialogue in the German state. What levels of government or civil society organize those dialogues? What do you know, if anything, about their downstream effects? Do people who are participants go out and project their new attitudes in their new surroundings? Just elaborate a little bit about those discussion circles, because they're really
It's a private initiative. It's a private initiative that became so successful that it spread. And first it spread in Germany. It started in what used to be East Germany by one West German who came back after 40 years. And then it spread in West Germany between Germans and Turks. And then, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, in what used to be East Germany, the Germans and Poles.
As a brief follow-up, do you think that's a very German cultural product, or do you think it's something that could be replicable in some form?
I think it could be. It's replicable. And there's interest in other European countries to maybe take over.
I'd like to bring up one particular aspect of being enfranchised versus disenfranchised through the use of the Constitution, the Equal Rights Amendment in the United States. Back in the late 70s, early 80s and all of that, we were working very hard to make the Constitution something that would respect women as well as men, as we thought. I mean, whether or not it was needed and all that, many decades of work afterward. And I'm wondering about those obvious expressions of disenfranchisement. I mean, for a while, I couldn't even look at a Constitution, a lot of my friends as well. I mean, knowing that it in some way, through the process that we went through, made an effort to exclude us in some ways. And now I'm wondering, along those lines, in terms of constitutions, what they would reflect in terms of how we see ourselves again as middle class. Do you see some other messages? You were talking about the middle class through the lens of the Constitution. Do you see some aspects that now, today, are not being well reflected in the US Constitution, especially, and all that well instituted, that are shutting people out. For example, the fact that so much effort is made to flesh out the corporate aspects of constitutional theory to the point at which our Supreme Court spends almost all its time, and only a little time on the human rights issues, but the majority of its time on the issues that might not impact immediately the lives of ordinary citizens.
Well, I talked about voting because I'm glad to hear that that's what you tell the students. When I talk to my liberal friends, they hardly ever talk about voting when they talk about next elections. And I came to read about it because in Pennsylvania, my friend asked me to join registering people and then bring people on election day to vote. And then it happened, I brought someone to vote who had registered, and she was told, no, we don't find you here. And then she walked home. And so I started reading about voting and the legal situation around it. And I was surprised how loosely the regulations and the constitutional understanding of all of that is built. And I thought, if I were an American constitutional lawyer, that's exactly what I would now do for the next 2 years. And maybe I've taught here for many years, and American constitutional scholarship is much further away from practice than where I come from. So that I bring cases to court or that I was a judge, that's rather normal in Germany. And here I think constitutional scholarship often is very, very theoretical. So I sometimes wonder, is it too low for some colleagues to get into these specifics of, and it's enormously complicated with all these different states, and every state has its own way to manipulate. So I don't know why, but reading about it, I thought there could happen more.
Strictly speaking, on a constitutional level, state power, constitutional level, the theory, as I understand it, of course, it's Recht versus Staat. The Staat is trying to encroach onto the Recht. In other words, the state is beginning to manipulate the Constitution. So there is a kind of a friction between the Constitution and the state. And that is resolved, let's say, in the United States under the Supreme Court, if I understand correctly. And where does it overlap into civil society? At the level of civil society, you have the ordinary courts. And how would you?
I would frame the initial situation slightly differently. I think it's not the state versus Recht, but I think it is that the prämienhaften legalen Machtbesitz are particularly high in the United States. And that seems to be a problem for the rule of law, the Rechtsstaat elements, and also the democratic elements by now in the United States. And I think that modern technology, gerrymandering, once you can use computers, becomes something so much more powerful than it ever was, that obviously what was more or less acceptable for a long time is less and less acceptable. And you say, how does it come into civil society and in the courts? Well, in the United States, everything starts with lower courts before it comes to the Supreme Court.
The gerrymandering issue, for example, is
It goes back and forth with you.
Thanks very much for a very illuminating and well-informed lecture. And I think your anecdote about the German-Asian dialogue is meant to somehow register the some disillusionment about the universality of constitutionalism. But for me, personally, I think I would rather see that as a sign of encouragement, because I guess 20 years ago, 10 to 20 years ago, nobody in German studies, especially in German legal studies, cared, about what Chinese are doing or the Vietnamese are doing with their law and with their attempt to sort of restructure constitutions. But now at least there are these institutionalized processes. There are all these dialogues going on, and so I'm personally I find that as a sign of improvement. At the same time, I think, even though I think I can totally understand your frustration, your sort of these things are going nowhere. Like these are questions that are not related to what you're talking about, and your answers may not be directly addressing their questions. These things do happen, but at the same time, I would say that the constitutionalism is a matter of some urgency, especially in China, that's where I'm from. For instance, I'll give you just one example. Like for these days, it is not just with the rapid growth of the economy and all that, it's not just a matter of how to protect rights, to enforce certain sort of property rights and all that, protect them. But at the same time, there is a concern about how to somehow curb this rapid division between rich and poor, and it's, at least I would say that the American version of this rule of law, it has a lot of, it did wonderful things, right? But there's one thing that it didn't do, or in general, like the rule of law as a thing in the West failed to do, that is to somehow to curb that division, and also the sort of the peril toward which the politics as a whole is collectively facing. So when you like in China, when you see those sort of heavy-handed government intervention in a marketplace to sort of somehow to bring a lot of weight upon the rich, there's a general glee as well. There is a lot of kind of some kind of positive reception of that kind of behavior. So I would say, I don't know what your thoughts about that. Somehow, like, how would you, is there some kind of room for what we understand as constitutional, as rule of law, to develop, to somehow not just safeguard some kind of a skeletal structure of how society as a whole runs, but also would develop these means, these devices to address contingencies, such as what's happening in China. I just want to know your thoughts about that. Thanks, sir.
I mean, the division between rich and poor we have in Germany too. And maybe it came a little bit later, because for a long time Germany was, after the war, a particularly egalitarian society, but it isn't anymore. And it's being discussed mostly around the question of taxes. So the only remedy most people see is raising taxes. And particularly inheritance tax. So you now have a generation of young people who didn't even make this money, just get these huge fortunes. So that's the discussion right now around the problem that you made.
But by the American example, we can almost see that capital always has a way to get around, get around these regulations somehow, right? To almost attain its own purposes. I was wondering if taxation, can be in the end as effective as one, wanted.
Well, not as effective as one would like. I think it can make a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, well, I have a question. So my question is, so you focus on this idea of the Rechtsstaat and the way in which legal order places restrictions on the state. And so one of the things that's not just sort of constitutional and cultural problem. And I was wondering, in the legal order itself, the legal order does consist of a set of traditions, and a tradition of jurisprudence that inflects the way the legal system functions, right? And so I guess I'm kind of wondering what you think then of the kind of idiosyncrasies of law, and whether, for instance, the United States has a specific kind of tradition of jurisprudence. Can you imagine a system, for instance, in Iran, where you have a different system of law? Could you imagine an Iran that has, as a basis of Islamic Sharia law, and that would have a legal system based on that and based on those traditions and interpreting law in that way? And would that still count for you as a Rechtsstaat, or is that something different?
Well, there's certainly elements of a Rechtsstaat. It doesn't work without elements of the Rechtsstaat. Without a certain clarity and reliability of law, and a certain reliability of law enforcement. So there are elements of the Rechtsstaat certainly there.
But I mean, I think it seems like you're focused on this kind of liberal tradition of that has certain liberal principles that ground it, whereas an alternative justice system might not include such liberal principles. And I'm just wondering what you would think of that.
Well, that's why I think trying to preserve building constitutionalism, what we can hold on to even if everything else is in danger, are these small tangible elements. And my experiences when I talk to foreign scholars, legal scholars, once we talk about concrete, everyday life constellations and legal constellations, we very fast can understand each other. So I think if I would talk to a colleague from Iran about problems of relationship between employer and employee and landlord and renter, and even about what precisely happens when somebody is taken by the police. What can the person do? What rights does it have? What can the outside do? How long does the person be incarcerated before he or she is brought before a judge? All these issues can be discussed, and there one can talk about, okay, one day maybe is too fast to require the judge to step in, 2 weeks is too long, and so what is acceptable to people and to families, all these things can be discussed, I think, with a colleague from a system like the Iran. There are certainly constitutional questions where we wouldn't agree, but I think that's why it's so important to put the appropriate weight on some of the things.
As you said, very interesting point that the neoliberal system does not require democracy. It's actually hostile to it. But then the question is, does it require constitutional law and legal system? Example is Turkey. Once the democracy is sort of eroded and goes, the dictatorship goes too far, it starts to erode also the juridical system, and the now sort of the big corporations, the Western corporations, are leaving. So can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Well, there are certainly points where the rule of law and the Rechtsstaat elements disappear to a degree that one can't communicate with them anymore and can't hope to work there anymore, and one has to wonder whether one really should accept an invitation to give a lecture there. Of course, there can be a point that's, where it's distracted to that point. That can happen. And I don't know what else to say.
I don't know what the situation is in Germany, but if I was to think of putting a legal constitutional challenge, the thing that should be determined would be both time and cost. Legal costs are astronomical, and the time it would take to actually engage in taking on perhaps a powerful adversary would mean that in fact I don't have a constitutional right in practice. It might have it in theory, but I don't have it in practice because it's just impractical to try and do certain things. I'm just wondering, is that your situation, or is how do you deal with the actual practice of?
I don't think I fully understood your question. Of course you can. I mean, you don't have to pay an attorney what you have to pay here. Very much cheaper. Most people have insurance. Insurance covers if you have to go to court. So the problem that going to court is here, it's definitely not in Germany, not by far.
Very quickly, it's about the general sort of frame of reference for this conference. I was wondering whether it's worth remembering the distinction made by Paul Schmidt between the Constitution and the constitutional law. I think it's perfectly okay if we agree that we are here talking about the constitutional law. First instance, the German-Chinese dialogue. If so, we are clear, we're talking about constitutional law. Then my assumption would be those Chinese or Vietnamese colleagues, as professionals, in other, to put it differently, would be reasonably open to various forms of rationalization, technicality, professionalism, whatever. But if we decide this is to a certain degree also about constitution, then it's about religion, it's about culture, it's about the collective emotional, historical assumptions that was, in a certain way, a crystallization of long historical developments. Then we will be facing a kind of problem very darkly described by people like Samuel Huntington as we want to be modern, but we don't want to be Western. Right? 20, 30, 40 years ago, the two are roughly the same thing. You have to be sufficiently Western in order to be modern. There's no way to make a distinction. Now, with the rise of China, India, the entire Western economy, technology, all these things seem to have created a far more leveled playing ground. Then, what if the Constitution, shared by, for the time being, just bracket these German, American, English, French differences. These are almost sentimental from the collective non-Western point of view. This is Western. This is something. This is a cultural, religious phenomenon. Let's put it that way. Dramatically. How would you respond to that? Or just this is a kind of a question for all of us. Are we, in the coming 2 days, to entertain this sort of this strong concept of constitution as such, as opposed to a more kind of a technical, procedural, professionalistic, legalistic notion of constitutional theory, or constitutional law, sorry, constitutional law?
I think we certainly have to talk about history and tradition and religion and the concept of man, of human, all of that.
Yeah.
I think I don't find it useful to talk about that under the rubric of constitution. I think Carl Schmitt invented the concept of constitution to delegitimize constitutional law, and as such it was effective. But do we need it? Does it really explain something to us? I think, yes, the look on culture, tradition, religion, etc. explains a lot. We have to engage with it. But I don't see what we get out of putting this into the concept of constitution and oppose it to the constitution.
But what about this constitution as an expression of some kind of political unity, a political will, a political consciousness? I would be having a hard time if someone tells me there's no such thing as the spirit of American Constitution. This, it's just a bunch of clauses or codification. I would assume that there is something like a pre-existing, not in the mythical terms, through historical experiences, collective struggle, whatever, memory. There is such a thing called the American Constitution above and beyond the concrete clauses.
I mean, you started talking about there's a specific tradition, a specific history, and a specific spirit grew out of that, and that kind of made the Constitution possible, and we can remember it.
Yeah.
But why put this into the concept of that's the American Constitution as opposed to the written Constitution? What do you win? I mean, what knowledge do you get by opposing this? That certainly is something to be talked about under the concept of constitution to the written constitution, written and practiced constitution.
This is not a debate. Yeah, it's a question. Yes. So wondering whether we would want to expand this notion of constitution beyond constitutional law. But given this subtitle of the conference, the cultural perspective,
I mean, talking about constitutional law, we have to have a cultural perspective. But what I really have my doubts about is how useful it is to put this into.
So we're out of time. So I'd like to thank Professor Schlink for his wonderful presentation.